Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar hosted by KADIT, the School of Comparative History of Religions, and a warm welcome to all participants and scholars, students, and those who are passionate about the topics we discussed today. And a quick information about KADIT. KADIT is an online independent research school focusing on the history of religions, organizing weekly programs, seminars, webinars, and other events on the topics related to history of religions, and inviting experts from all over the world. And if you want to be a part of KADIT, you can just check out our X page and fill the form of application of being a KADIT researcher. And or if you want to be a participant simply in the events, just as you did today, you can fill the form as well again and be participant in these events and in upcoming events. And before I pass the floor to Bushra, I am now honored to introduce our special guest, Bruce Lincoln, Professor Bruce Lincoln. His influential work on myth, ideology, and religion has shaped how we think about these subjects today. And Professor, thank you for being with us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being in KADIT. It is a real pleasure and honor to be before you and to have you in KADIT. And floor is Bushra's. Bushra.
Welcome, dear Professor Lincoln, and welcome everybody. This evening, as Mircea had already told, a great pleasure for us to welcome dear Professor Lincoln. My name is Mircea Elmas, and I will be the moderator for this session today. I will begin with a short introduction, after which Professor Lincoln will share his insights on the topic. After that, we will open the floor for a Q&A session. In the Q&A session, you will be able to ask your questions either by using raise hand function or simply by writing them in the chat box. Well, now I would like to introduce Professor Lincoln. Professor Bruce Lincoln is the professor of history of religions in the University of Chicago Divinity School. He completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago in 1976, where he studied under Mircea Eliade. Throughout his career, Professor Bruce Lincoln has written numerous publications, including Theorizing Myth, Narrative, Ideology, and Scholarship, which won the American Academy of Religions Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion. In addition to Theorizing Myth, his notable works also include Holy Terrors, Thinking About Religion After September 11, and Discourse and the Construction of Society, Comparative Studies of Myth, Ritual, and Classification. His works are widely regarded for his critical and interdisciplinary approach, engaging with diverse historical periods and cultures. We are very, very excited to hear from him today and look forward to the insights he will share with us. It gives me a great pleasure to hand the floor over Professor Bruce Lincoln. So, floor is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to meet with all of you. Let me just say a few brief things, and then we can open for discussion. When I was a student and first became interested in the study of myth, like most students, I was confused, and I was open to all sorts of influences. At times, I thought I wanted to study history, philosophy, literature. I entertained other interests as well. And I stumbled into the study of myth. It was a very fashionable topic at the time. And I read a number of works that influenced me and excited me to pursue that work. I think most of them were misguided and seductive, but I appreciate that they got me started. One of the things that particularly intrigued me at the time was a debate that was then famous and I think still has its importance between the great German biblical scholar Rudolf Bultmann and the great philosopher Karl Jaspers. And Bultmann argued that the most pressing need in the study of religion was, as he put it, to demythologize the New Testament, to get all of that foolish mythic business out of the way so that you could get the real truth and message. And Jaspers responded that myth was central, not only to religion, but was the founding point for poetry, philosophy, religion, speculative thought of all sorts, and that to get rid of it was a disastrous mistake, that myth was this precious, genre that was foolishly devalued by the Enlightenment and others. And what I didn't realize at the time was that those two great scholars were replicating a much broader myth of broader dispute of historic importance that essentially pitted German Romanticism against the French Enlightenment. Within the French Enlightenment, there was the attempt to establish a radically novel regime of truth in which reason would displace faith and science would displace other forms of authoritative discourse that claimed the status of truth without having done the hard work to deserve that claim. Myth fell in that category. And the philosophers of the Enlightenment replicated the move in that, as the slogan goes, from mythos to logos. We replace myth with reason and we're all better for it. And myth then acquires the status of false story, pretentious story, misleading story. In response to that, and I also should point out that the argument of the Enlightenment was that reason was universal. It not only was dependable, but it was the same everywhere. And that all humanity would benefit from this move from myth to reason. The response of the Romantics was to claim that that which was local was precious. That which was old and traditional was what gave cultures their integrity. That myth was a storehouse of a given group's past history, dreams, aspirations, values, their distinctive worldview. And that to abandon that would be a tragic loss that one had to treasure and nourish and recover myth along with other crucial expressions of a given people. And it was an argument of particularism against universalism, of Germany against France, and of different models of what kind of discourse really should hold authority and respect and command the attention of people everywhere. I think there's something to both sides of that argument. To focus on myth, it seems to me, lets you understand the particular values and identity of the people who treasure that myth. Myth, the characteristics that I think are typical of any myth are, first, it's a narrative. It has the structure of a story, a beginning, a middle, and end, characters, action, a problem that is somehow addressed and resolved. Second, it's a foundational narrative. It's a story of profound importance to those who tell and hear it. It establishes, structures, values, institutions that persist. It's not a mere fiction. It's a story that's related to the reality people live and explains how that reality came into being and justifies its continuation. It's also a story that enjoys authority. It is not told just for amusement. It's not a story designed to delight and then be forgotten. It commands respect and attention. It announces its own importance. It claims not just to be true, but to be true in ways that matter profoundly. It's an abiding truth, and it's an informing truth that helps people structure their lives. Last of all, a myth is anonymous. There's no author attached to this particular story. Rather, it's a story that's told and retold countless times. Within a given population where a myth circulates, It's a story known to everyone and appreciated by everyone. Some may engage it more critically than others. Some may engage it more, devotedly than others. But it's a story that everyone knows, has heard many times, and will retell themselves. It thus has a sense of being a collective product. And to say it's a collective product, I think, doesn't go far enough, because the collective that produces it is itself, in large measure, the product of that myth. That myth tells them who they are, what they value, where they come from, how they came to be the way they are, what values they need to cherish and defend, and how they differ from others around them who tell different stories, that narrate a different past, that cultivate different values, that establish different institutions. And so inevitably, mythic discourse creates a strong sense of solidarity, collective identity among those who share it. And it creates a sense of alterity, of difference, distinct and significant difference from others who don't appreciate that story, but who have other stories that the we who tell a given story themselves don't appreciate. And it's that role in community formation and preservation and establishment that I think was particularly important to the German Romantics. They did not want to be Frenchified. They did not want to be told, we all have the same reasoning faculties. We all should reach the same conclusions. We all should establish the same kinds of institutions, enact the same laws, supported by universal reason. They wanted to say, we're not like you. What you value is not what we value. Your past is not our past. Your institutions are not for us. And it's this tension between unity and diversity that seems to me is at the heart of that dispute about myth versus science, faith versus reason, tradition versus progress. After many years of working with mythic materials from a great many different cultural areas, I came to be less sympathetic to the German position than I had been earlier. And it seemed to me that preservation of ethnic, racial, folkish, national difference generated conflicts, historic and those that are too small for history to record, that are recurrent and often enough brutal, culminating in the Second World War, where mythic identity of a Germanic sort was crucial to National Socialism. And it seems to me the extreme example of where devotion to myth and to the sense of self, collective self cultivated by myth, can lead. And I came to describe myth in much more critical terms than Bultmann had ever described it. For Bultmann, myth was just false story, pre-scientific, indefensible, illogical nonsense. I'm inclined to treat myth as, the way I put it was, ideology in narrative form. It is a persuasive, seductive, compelling form of persuasion that cultivates a sense of collective self in opposition to other collective selves, and that rests on nothing more than stories. The story of Nuer and Dinka that I put at the center of the article that I asked you to read, for me, has been one of the most instructive examples. Its clarity and its simplicity, I think, are elegant The story constructs the people who tell it as God's chosen people who have been cheated and wronged by their neighbors and therefore are justified in aggression against those neighbors. The neighbors are described as thieves, cunning, not to be trusted, and people who have wronged the us of this story. We are God's favorites. They have deceived God himself. And this is embedded in the consciousness of the New Era people. It gives structure and meaning to their lives. It justifies all manner of actions. I can understand why the story appeals. I can understand why it's told and retold and embraced as foundational, authoritative truth. But to me, it's a clear example of an ideology that has profound disruptive effects. The book I wrote, titled Theorizing Myth, makes that argument. In the wake of that, book, I had many discussions with friends and colleagues. Among the most important was, a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, Marshall Solins, who died last year, and was a wonderful friend and one of the world's great anthropologists. And his training as an anthropologist, his disciplinary ethic is the task is to understand other cultures, not to criticize them. And if the New Era take this as truth, it is not just a belief, it is not just an ideology, it is something they know. And our task as non-New Era who might be interested in this is to understand their knowledge and their world, not to critique it. And we had many fascinating but inconclusive discussions along those lines. He ultimately persuaded that it is a legitimate approach to myth to treat it as local knowledge, not ideology, not something to be dismissed as a false story, but to be entertained as a shaping foundational truth. The paper I wrote was largely in the wake of Marshall's death, and I had never gotten around to paying sufficient tribute to his influence and his work. And I wanted to entertain his point of view as well as my own, and the view of Michel Foucault, entertaining myth as a discourse that creates that of which it speaks, seemed to me a way to mediate the difference between Marshall's position and my own. At the end, I'm persuaded that all three, ideology, knowledge, and discourse, have virtues. And one isn't forced to decide among them. In studying any given myth or myth in general, it seems to me all 3 points of view are worthy of consideration. And I tried to show that apropos first of the New Era myth. And then I wanted to make the point, myth is not just something out there that other people have. Every society has its myth. And within the myth, there's not just one variant, there are multiple versions, and they reflect differences internal to the society. It's not just that myth constructs an us and them that conforms to national or tribal or ethnic borders. Even inside the world of those who tell the same story, there are differences in the way they tell it, the emphasis they give, the characters they introduce, the way they plot the action. And that reflects serious differences inside of a population that has its own debates and conflict. And it seemed to me that the American mythology of the founding of the United States was a particularly instructive and appropriate and timely example to pursue. And so that I introduced as well. That's more or less what I have to say by way of introduction. It's an attempt to sketch how I reached the positions I did, why I came to modify them, and where I am now. And if there's anything any of you would like to discuss, I'm delighted to do so.
Dear Professor, thank you for those insights. That was very informative. So we can open the floor for Q&A if anything wants to start. We can wait.
I have a question from the article.
Please.
And as I said in the beginning, I love the article. My major is theology, sir. So we discussed a lot about the philosophical hermeneutics theory of Hans-Georg Gadamer.
Mhm.
So your argument is the mythic narratives are potent instrument for the reproduction of cultural values and social forms.
Yes.
And it seems like it seems like that the definition of myth in your argument is dynamic and performative, just as in Gadamer's hermeneutic theory. So is there any similarity between Gadamer's hermeneutic theory and your theory about this dynamism and performativeness?
Oh dear. I mentioned that, as a student 100 years ago, I was interested in philosophy. I lost that interest. I have never read Gadamer seriously. It would be pretentious of me to even try to engage the question. I found, I have no talent for philosophy at all, and it just is a subject. Whenever I try to read it, I find myself frustrated at the abstraction and unable to engage in as seriously as I would like. So I have to pass on that question. If you think there are similarities, I'm flattered, because Gadamer is a major serious figure, but I'm not the one to comment on whether my work resembles his or not. Sorry.
It's okay. So anyone?
I have a question, actually. I wonder if your approach of interpreting myths as ideologies also be applied to religions.
Yes. I mean, my sense of religion is that religion is not what it claims and thinks itself to be. Religion is a human discourse supported by human institutions, that imagine they are something more than human. And that leap of the imagination yields them an authority that is not available in any other form. The example I frequently cite is the difference between saying, when you want to discourage acts of homicide, the statement, by act of Congress or Parliament or whatever legal institutions we have, we judge homicide to be illegal and punishable under law. And I am the Lord your God, thou shalt not kill. The first statement, they both try to discourage people killing one another, which is, a good thing. But the first statement constructs this as a human decision, agreed upon by a set of authorized human actors, and therefore subject to reconsideration and debate and revision, and all sorts of questions can arise because it's a human decision. And it may be a very good decision and a fine idea, but being human, humans are subject to error and to rethinking things. God is not subject to error and rethinking. If it is a divine commandment, there is no further debate or discussion possible. Religion represents itself as something that originates beyond the human, be it gods, spirits, angels, primordial ancestors, revelations of, other sorts. And because of its extra-human origin, I should say, it's putative, it's purported, it's imaginary extra-human origin, it tries to construe itself as inviolable, unchangeable, absolute, eternal, and enjoying an authority no human creation can enjoy. I think that's an astounding move and a very historically and socially important move. I also think it's pretentious and it's both mistaken and misrepresentative. There may be gods, there may be spirits, there may be angels. I have no idea. That's beyond my intelligence. But I know that when human beings claim that they are putting forth the word of God or something revealed to them by spirits, I am suspicious. I think they're kidding themselves and others, and that religion regularly and successfully makes that move. And yes, I would call this ideology.
Okay. So it depends on the people interpret them, actually. They're not inherently ideological, the myths and religions, but the people interprets them to fit their ideologies or to their interests.
Well, I think both the narrators and the audience are involved in interpretation and ideology. The way you tell a story reflects your interest. Telling stories is not idle. People have a purpose. They wish to persuade others of something. They may wish to persuade them that, you need to be careful, you shouldn't kill people, you need to be honest. I mean, there are very benign persuasions, but they're still ideological. These are points of view that others attempt to render persuasive and reshape the consciousness of the audiences who hear those. There are other stories that say this is the nature of heroism, this is the nature of sacrifice. These are the things a good person should do in support of his or her community. These lead people to give up their lives or their wealth or their property or their attachments to their family in support of some greater unit. Again, this is ideology. It may be beneficial. It may be harmful. Ideology can work wonders of various sorts. But if you believe that because of a story you've heard, you've not engaged in a certain kind of rational evaluation. Should I be persuaded by this? Is this really an argument that leads me somewhere I want to go and gets me there by steps that are each and every one of them justified? You're not submitting it to what the French Enlightenment would call universal tests of reason. You're simply being carried away by a seductive story and a claim of authority that this is an important story that makes us who we are. We need to pay attention to it. We need to shape ourselves in that way. And the story may be in sacred scripture or Hollywood film. They both work in similar fashion. If they inspire people to live a certain kind of life, and many stories do, it seems to me that's a moment of ideological persuasion, not rational, scientific, data-based and, defensible, persuasion. It may lead to the same place, and it's surely more economical. You can persuade much more quickly and many more people through a good story than any other means available. But the people you've persuaded haven't bought in on the basis of the argument. They've been seduced by an attractive, compelling, moving, emotionally satisfying, discourse.
Okay, thank you.
I have
Professor.
another question, might be related. When I read the tables, I actually surprised by the similarities between Biden's statements and Capitol Hill and the Noah's myth. And my question is, our leaders or our officials or leaders, just statements of leaders today, are somehow directing us to some certain points of the understanding, as same as the myths actually in the past directed us to some points. I wonder if these statements are going to be defined as the future myths in the future. What is your decision?
Entirely possible. I mean, I think whenever people in the present speak about the past, they do so for reasons of the present. You know, there's something in the world they live in that prompts them to look back to a certain moment of earlier time in the hope that they'll find something inspiring or guiding or orienting. And so the story, it seems to me, of the past always exists in some sort of dialectic relation to the moment of reflection and narration. Certain pieces of the past get referenced much more frequently than any others, you know, and usually it's stories of origins. You know, it's the moment that the people who tell this story feel we came into being as such. And our ancestors established the model of what we ought to be and who we are. And reflecting on them is always a good thing. But I think every time somebody reflects on those ancestors, they bring their interests of the moment to that reflection, and which piece of the story about the ancestors they happen to focus on, and what it is they make of that moment, and how they develop that. It's not just you learn from the past. You reshape the past you talk about from what you've learned in the present. And there's this ongoing exchange between past and present that I think is ceaseless. And I think that's how myths operate. I know in the US, the myth of those we refer to as, and the phrase is fascinating, our founding fathers, you know, is relentless. You know, any important question, sooner or later, someone invokes our founding fathers, who are supposed to present the solution to whatever problem we're grappling with. And that exercise, I think, is you know, inescapably mythic.
There is another one. There is a question by
Yes,
Sabahattin Tarhan. How can I let him?
his microphone is.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful views about describing the myths and their relations with our existing society. With the reference of your article, you know, while you are describing the modern time myths, you give reference to Foucault to understand the power and knowledge relations, and as well as the conflict of subject and object.
Yes.
But in general, I just want to clarify one issue. Of course, there was the existence of subject and object since the beginning of time to understand the world. But for the modern ages, the relation between subject and object, it was a conflict instead of a dichotomy. Used to be during the ages of, you know, the religions, because they have a holistic and universalist approaches towards humankind. And as you mentioned, that myths also has some kind of belongs to the whole humankind. So how can we explain the role of myths before the modern ages? Because Foucault's criticism towards the political relations is directly towards the related with the modern ages, just because of the conflict. But my question is, how can we understand the myth's role for the pre-modern ages? It can be during the ages of religions and way beyond it. Thank you.
Foucault is a wonderful author and an extraordinary intellect. And he is, you know, much of his work is focused on the advent of modernity. Very little of his work is focused on anything pre-modern, save for occasional excursions into Greek. And I think had he studied anthropology more seriously, and had he studied, say, Mesopotamian civilizations more seriously, I think he would have been less inclined to stress the difference between modernity and what preceded. The chief difference that I see as a student of myth is that the apparatus for distribution of powerful narratives is much more effective since the advent of printing, and even more effective since electronic media. And stories can circulate, much more widely, much more rapidly. Many more variants of a given story can gain a hearing, but the way in which the stories affect those who tell them and those who hear them, I think, has changed much less than one might expect. That the chief difference is one is bombarded with such an overabundance of stories, most of which will be discarded as trivial and forgotten quickly, and only a few of which will continue to be told and retold and taken seriously and invested with authority. And that sorting mechanism of which ones are we going to pay attention to, which ones will prevail, which ones will prove dispensable and short-lived, that's not typical of pre-modernity. And that probably deserves a great deal more attention than I or anyone else has been able to give it thus far. But those stories that achieve authoritative status and continue to circulate and influence, I'm inclined to think the difference between the way such things happened in Babylon or Persia or Egypt is much less great than one would imagine.
Thank you so much. Okay.
There is another question in the chat. Hello, Mr. Bruce Lincoln. How do you respond to scholars who prefer traditional sacred interpretations of myth over your ideological approach? The question is...
I suppose to engage a serious conversation along those lines would begin with simply asking why. What is it that they prefer that leads them to, adopt such theories and work with them? What is the advantage? What is the nature of their commitments that leads them to favor those? I would assume that it's some sort of religious commitment that they regard as binding and rewarding, but I would want to hear more before I would leap to that conclusion.
Thank you. The next question by Taha Portage. Okay.
Hi, Professor.
You can ask.
Hello.
First of all, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thanks. If you allow me, I have two questions.
Please.
First, how do you see the relationship between myth and modern storytelling mediums such as film and digital media? And second, after.
Go ahead.
Okay. In your opinion, what role do myths play in shaping collective identity within different cultures today?
With regard to the first, one of the chief differences is production values. I mean, when you spend millions of dollars to produce a film, you can, produce effects that are profoundly affecting. When you're simply recounting by word of mouth, you have to play on the imagination. You have to engage, your listeners in very different ways. I think a good storyteller cultivates skills that approach what a good filmmaker can do. But with a large budget and a skilled set of professionals and technicians, the effects of a Hollywood film are extraordinarily different than even the best oral narrator. The second great difference is distribution. That a film can reach the globe, whereas orality is local and communal, and the borders of how far a story travels are much more restrictive. I think for that reason, oral narrative engages in specificity and particularity that are deeply ingrained in the audience. And large budget multimedia presentations tend to generalities that are designed to engage a huge worldwide audience, because that's, well, the third point, I guess, I omitted and now occurs to me is profit. People make films in order to make money. People do not recount oral mythology in order to bring in cash. They do it as a communal part of being, within a group of people with whom one shares values and memories and experience and a local environment that all know very well. So I would say the differences are the profit motive, the means of distribution, the expansiveness of the audience, and the loss of particularity and the stretch for something like universal global appeal that I think leads one to tell a different kind of story, and in ways a much less interesting story. Your second question, remind me again?
Okay. What role do myths play in shaping collective identity
Today, collective identity.
Especially today?
I think the myths that play the strongest role at present are, for religious communities, those that are enshrined in sacred scripture and have an authority claim of the highest order. Second, the stories of national origin that are promoted in primary schools backed by state education in nation states, through which the state attempts to create citizens of the nation who will be loyal and faithful and embody the virtues that the state takes to be its own. And those stories are repeated and renewed and disseminated at an impressionable age and forever after. I think those are extraordinarily powerful stories. And then occasionally there are multimedia. The one that infuriates me is the film Rambo, which persuaded Americans that the Vietnam War was a noble cause, lost because of traitorous governments that weren't sufficiently dedicated, and it left it to real patriots who took weapons in hand and faced all obstacles to set things right. It seems to me that in my nation, at least, that absolutely reversed the lessons that should have been learned from the disastrous war in Vietnam, and authorized and legitimated and encouraged and militia style, take the law into your own hands, the state is your enemy, there's corruption everywhere mentality that culminates in the Donald Trump movement that it seems to me a perversion of the values I was raised on, but has achieved enormous currency and is told and retold in countless variants and enjoys wide credibility. And occasionally there is a film or a television show or a novel that somehow speaks to latent needs of a large audience and engages their imagination so powerfully that the story gets told and retold and treated as if it were foundational truth. And that's surprising when it happens, but always possible for any story. And whenever something gains that kind of status, there's an issue there worth exploring. Does that sufficiently address the question, or is there more you want me to say?
Sorry.
Okay. Now we can take 2 more questions, maybe, because we are bumping our deadline. There is one question in the chat box. Are myths within the scope of archaeology and anthropology or religious sciences? What is the role of interdisciplinary relationships in studies on myths?
I think that all of those have a claim, and others as well. Literary studies, film studies, sociology, history, education studies. I am a very badly disciplined scholar myself, and I think disciplines tend to construct certain questions and certain evidence as crucial, and they often ignore all sorts of interesting issues and problems. And many arenas of potential inquiry, myth being one of them, fall between the cracks of disciplines. And I tend to be not just interdisciplinary, but anti-disciplinary. I think one should follow curiosity wherever it leads and develop the skills that are necessary to pursue the questions you take to be important. And simply repeating the work of others who happen to be in your discipline is easy and satisfying and rarely surprising and revelatory. And I think myth is one of the areas that has seldom gotten the attention it deserves and needs, in part because it doesn't fall neatly within any single discipline.
We have another question from Huria Biden. You can ask your question.
Please.
Thank you so much. Hello, welcome, sir. Hello, sir. If it is possible, I would like to ask you a question about Professor Eliade. Possible?
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Eliade is criticized for having a very cursory knowledge of Islam and not covering this subject much. Also, he has researched many religions. What do you think is the reason for this?
I can only speculate. I never discussed this directly with him, so I have no privileged, knowledge on the subject.
You're right.
I think he was not unusual in his generation in giving Islam inadequate attention. That Western scholars, almost without exception, generalists, did not include much on Islam. They left it to specialists. There were some wonderful specialized students of Islam. Marshall Hodgson, for instance, was a friend and contemporary of Eliade's. But what Hodgson was doing and what specialists in Islam were doing at that time, I don't think he read or followed closely. And he certainly incorporated almost none of it in his own work. As I take it, his work started with an interest in esoteric trends in Western philosophy, and particularly within Orthodox Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And his studies in India as a young man opened a whole new world to him and influenced him deeply. And those two poles he knew well and were his touchstones. And they let him develop certain general constructs that he thought would be universally applicable. And he read widely. He read in all sorts of areas, but he read selectively. Whenever he hit on something that confirmed his ideas, that went into the next article he was writing or got put into a footnote, and it became part of his consciousness, not for its place within that world, but for the detail that best fit his models. And Islam didn't fit his models all that well, and so he didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And he took it for granted that if he really knew it better, it would fit his models, but he also knew that to know it better would take years and years of hard work, and he wasn't ready to do that. That's my best guess, but I am speculating. It's not anything I know for certain.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Dear Professor, I said 2 last questions, but speaking of Mircea Eliade, I want to ask, how did it feel like to be a student of a giant scholar like Mircea Eliade? Because most of the attendees here must have been familiar with Eliade's works, because maybe all or most of his works have been translated into Turkish, and it is on our reading lists in religious studies or history departments. So would you like to share your experiences, or if there anything that you learned from him as advice, or I don't know?
I went to Chicago in order to study with him. I mean, that was he was my guiding star as a young student. And initially, I was not able to work with him, and that was a great disappointment. And when I found my way to his office and he accepted to work with me, I thought I was going to be his last student. He had one more after me, but I thought I was fantastically lucky and privileged. And he was an extraordinary inspirational figure. He was kind, he was gentle, he was encouraging, he was full of energy and enthusiasm. I thought he knew everything there was to know. In contrast to a great many other professors that I worked with, he was never critical or harsh. He was never difficult or insensitive. He was, in my experience, an absolutely lovely human being and an inspiring mentor. Now, having said that, I also should say his work, I have come to see problems and flaws, and some of the criticisms leveled at him are just, and I have to accept that. But I also think there was much of great value, and that one can acknowledge his failings without rushing to discard everything the man ever wrote. I think there's a great deal of deep insight and rare learning and originality. But I also have become much more aware of an ideological strain that runs through much of his work that I think is very dangerous, and his commitments as a young man to the Romanian fascist movement were powerful and important, and aspects of that continue to inform his work. And there is an underlying ideology in many of his writings that I think one has to handle with great critical caution. And so for me, it's become a very complicated matter to read his work and to think about him, because personally, I adored him and I remain loyal to his memory. And politically, I am on a very, very different position from his. And I think my politics informed my scholarship. His politics informed his. Our sense of morality is not the same. And that complicates him for me.
Okay, thank you for sharing this one with us. And thank you generally for this amazing session. And thank you all of the attendees. And I turn the floor over Mircea to close the seminar.
Thank you, Professor. It was a great pleasure, as I said in the beginning. If you want to add something, finally, we can hear. And if you don't have, we can close the session.
Well, I want to thank you all for your questions and your interest, your kind invitation. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I expected it would be, and it exceeded my expectations. This really has been delightful. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
And thank you for all participants, scholars, students, and for those who are passionate about the subject. Thank you all, and please be tuned and follow our X page. Thank you, and good evening. Good evening, Professor.
Good evening to you all.
Bye.